Well, time for the view now, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. And in the cartoon, The Telegraph, Boris Johnson is trying to get the Brexit deal done by jumping through a hoop of fire, all on the stage in Manchester, with someone remarking, "I haven't felt this optimistic since 1985. And I have to say, I don't quite know what that's a reference to, but some people do. Well, support for Mr Johnson in the Daily Express, with Leo McKinstry praising his energy and charisma. Yet it wasn't one of the Prime Minister's finest speeches. He says it doesn't quite match the immediate needs of the hour either. Ireland's Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has backed himself into a corner, according to Liam Halligan in The Telegraph today, saying the Taoiseach has used the border issue for domestic electoral gain and so won't be able to respond positively to Boris Johnson's reasonable offer. Peter Brook's cartoon in The Times shows Boris Johnson attacking Jeremy Corbyn at the Conservative Party conference with a nod to Theresa May's famous "remind you of anyone" comment. Jane Moore in The Sun criticises Prince Harry for his statement in which he attacked parts of the media, specifically the Mail on Sunday. His mother Diana, she says, knew not to judge everyone by the actions of the few. That view is echoed by Stephen Glover, writing in the Mail, who warns Prince Harry's diatribe against the press is sadly misguided. Jenny Russell, writing in The Times, says that talk of betrayal may well end up hurting the Tories. She says that once voters are led to believe Parliament is full of a treacherous bunch of self-serving MPs opposing the will of the people, why would they think differently after the next election? And in The Guardian, George Monbiot asks if democracy is in a death spiral. Humans are incapable of hearing calm voices when we feel threatened, he says, according to latest research. And he urges people to emulate Greta Thunberg and the way she responds to the abuse she comes under. In the I newspaper, Vicky Spratt argues the country needs more affordable homes, and she criticises the government, whose priorities, she say, lie elsewhere. Well, joined today to talk through those are the columnist on The Times, Melanie Phillips, and the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. Welcome to you both. Now, Melanie Phillips, these two columns by Liam McKinstry and Liam Halligan, both supporters of Brexit, but actually both of them concluding that what was announced yesterday won't fly.
Well, indeed. This is all to do with getting Brexit done by solving the insoluble, infamous Northern Ireland backstop, which I have to say reminds me of an even more insoluble and even more famous conundrum in the 19th century, the Schleswig-Holstein question, of which Palmerston said famously, only 3 men have ever understood this. One was Prince Albert, who is dead. One was a professor who went mad. And the third is me, and I've forgotten it. Yeah. And it does remind me very much of that. But
is that really what it's all about? I mean,
yes.
It's such a complicated proposal from Boris Johnson. He's basically just putting it in the bin, and Northern Ireland as well, and saying, let's get on with the big issue of getting out of...
This, in my view, he is following exactly the same mistake that Mrs May made, which is basically to get Brexit done. In other words, let us leave on October the 31st, and almost regardless of what it actually means. And the fact is, this thing has been stalled allegedly over the Northern Ireland backstop, allegedly over the border problem, the problem of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland being divergent when it comes to membership of the European Union. And, to solve that border problem, they've now come up with the brilliant ways of creating 2 borders. Now, the original border problem, which now becomes a customs border under Boris's plan, still remains a border. I was listening to Sinn Féin this morning saying this is completely unacceptable, it breaks the Good Friday Agreement, we're still going to have customs checks at the border. Whether or not you think that is a valid complaint, that was the original complaint. It hasn't gone away. And what Boris is banking on is the DUP. He has bought off the DUP. The DUP have been bought off, it would appear, by being given an effective veto over the Northern Ireland's continued membership of the single market, presumably because the British government thinks the DUP will always veto that. But as we've also been hearing overnight and this morning, it would appear that virtually unanimously the business community in Northern Ireland is horrified by this because basically every 4 years they'll be kind of wondering whether or not we're going to continue in this. And that sort of uncertainty, it's uncertainty which is the death knell for business.
And at the same time, just been speaking to James Gray, we've had optimistic noises coming from Westminster. Is this really about, saying to the European Union, this may be a rubbish proposal, but if you don't approve it, if you don't agree to it, you'll get the blame, not me, for what happens next?
I'm sure that's exactly what he intends to achieve. He wants to create a narrative where he basically says, look, EU would be unreasonable. In fact, leaks overnight would suggest that is exactly the message that they're trying to put out. But it relies on something that is completely pointless. I mean, if you go to the EU with a proposal that goes across all of their red lines, so red line on North-South cooperation, red line on single market integrity, red line on frictionless trade, then of course they are going to say no. I mean, he might as well have designed it from the ground up as something that they were going to reject. So then the talk suddenly switches, and journalists are partly responsible for this, to what's going on in Westminster, totting up the numbers and going, well, these DUP guys and these Labour guys. It doesn't matter. Why are we talking about the way that MPs are going to vote in Westminster when there is a plan there that is never going to make it to Westminster? It's a completely pointless endeavour.
Now, certainly Liam Halligan, who, as I say, has been a supporter of Brexit and Boris Johnson, he points the finger at the Irish government, Leo Varadkar. Do you think that, Mr Varadkar can or should be demonised?
Well, Mr Varadkar, in my view, speaking as a convinced Brexiteer, has been playing irresponsible politics throughout, playing to his domestic constituency for sure, but playing also to the EU. He's been basically doing the EU's bidding and, in my view, creating an insuperable problem over the border with Northern Ireland, which, in my view, didn't have to be insuperable at all and is not insuperable.
But it isn't answered by this latest idea.
It's not answered by this latest idea. So he's kind of trapped in this whole situation. But as Ian says, ultimately, what Mr Varadkar thinks doesn't really matter very much. And I'm sure he's very put out, as we can see, for all the reasons that he is saying. But ultimately, it's not up to him; it's up to the EU. And the EU may save him because the EU will think, quite apart from the fact that they quite clearly, by all the signs that are coming out, they don't like the actual deal that's being offered, why would they agree to something which crosses any of their red lines when the alternative is no deal? How terrible is that? Well, not, in their mind, because Parliament, they know, is completely against no deal. And there's the Ben Act, which means that Boris has got to come back and ask for an extension, which presumably they will give in order to create the space for what? Another referendum, an election, and then Britain resumes being a member of the EU, whatever. Why should they agree?
So has Varadkar painted himself into a corner, as Liam Halligan says?
No, the piece is very strange. It's sort of classic doublethink, because half of the piece says, well, here's how important UK-Irish trade is to Ireland. And he says, and now it was a completely sort of, self-interested, foolish political gesture for Varadkar to oppose this stuff. And you think, well, no. The reason he opposed having a sort of hard border in Ireland was precisely because the economics was so reliant on that trade. So Ireland was presented with a problem. It didn't have a vote in the referendum. It had no voice on any of this and just had this problem just dumped on it in a manner that is morally similar to what happened in Northern Ireland. Of course, Northern Ireland, they voted against Brexit. So those two communities were opposed. To then turn to the Prime Minister of Ireland and say, oh, well, he's playing self-interested games. No, he is representing his country, which is sort of in the job description. OK,
thank you very, very much, Steve. Look forward to seeing you in the next hour. This is All Out Politics coming up next. Well, let's get the view now, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. Jumping through a hoop of fire, Boris Johnson trying to get Brexit done in Manchester. That's Bob's cartoon in the Telegraph. Support for Mr Johnson in the Express of sorts. Leo McKinstry praising his energy and charisma, yet it wasn't one of the Prime Minister's finest speeches, he says. It didn't quite match the immediate needs of the hour. Ireland's Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, has backed himself into a corner. That's according to Liam Halligan, writing in the Daily Telegraph. He says the Taoiseach has used the border issue for domestic electoral gain and won't be able to respond positively to Boris Johnson's reasonable offer. Peter Brooks' cartoon in The Times shows Boris Johnson attacking Jeremy Corbyn at the Conservative Party conference in language which seems a little bit familiar, and there's a nod to Theresa May's famous "remind you of anyone" comment. Jane Moore in The Sun criticises Prince Harry for his statement in which he attacked parts of the media, specifically the Mail on Sunday. His mother, Diana, says that she knew not to judge everyone by the actions of the few. That view is echoed by Stephen Glover, writing in the Mail. He warns Prince Harry's diatribe against the press is sadly misguided. Jenny Russell in The Times warns that talk of betrayal may well end up hurting the Conservatives. She says that once voters are led to believe that Parliament is full of a treacherous bunch of self-serving MPs opposing the will of the people, why would they think differently after a general election? In The Guardian, George Monbiot asks if democracy is in its death spiral. Humans are incapable of hearing calm voices when we feel threatened, he says. He urges people to emulate Greta Thunberg and the way that she responds to the abuse she faces. And in the newspaper, Vicky Spratt argues the country needs more affordable homes, and she criticises the government's priorities in selling some social housing off. Well, joining today to look through those are the Times columnist Melanie Phillips and the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. And talking of George Monbiot's suggestion that we should all be reasonable, he does praise Extinction Rebellion, but actually we got these pictures just in from the Treasury of the latest action by Extinction Rebellion. They have sprayed red paint in Whitehall onto the building, which actually now that front bit is DCMS and HMR. Apparently this is 1,800 litres of fake blood. Yeah. And they're using an out-of-commission fire engine. Sorry, they are at the back. They are actually at the Treasury on Whitehall there. You impressed?
I'm not impressed by the argument that we should all regard them as the saviours of democracy. They are a revolutionary, nihilistic movement. And the idea that, we should take Greta Thunberg as a sort of role model of how we should react. I mean, let me say, I share very much the concern about the way democracy is going. I share very much the concern about the incivility and unspoken and actual violence that we're seeing. But the idea that Greta Thunberg is a role model, this child, first of all, we're being asked to emulate a child. We're being asked to say, a disturbed, 16, vulnerable child is a role model. And secondly, her performance at the UN was hardly a model of restraint. She was incredibly angry. She burst into tears. And she said, the end of the world is nigh. I mean, this seems to me to be an example of how we have collectively, we are collectively experiencing not just a crisis of democracy, but a crisis of reason.
I don't see how they can be nihilistic. I mean, they're pretty clear about what their beliefs are. They're clearly fighting for something. It doesn't matter whether someone...
They're not exactly interested in dialogue, though, are they?
Well, I don't really get... I mean, look, it's a protest movement. So at the spot of the protest, the dialogue does not take place. And you have pranks like pinning stuff with the walls. Look, it's not really my way either. I mean, I wear pocket hankies, so this is not exactly what I'm doing on my weekends. But that's what a protest movement does. That's how it behaves. It's to do with sort of visual imagery. It's to do with trying to create theatre on the street and trying to promote. Yeah,
but you see, the Monbiot article is somehow saying they're showing an example of reasoned discussion and people's assemblies, where actually it seems to me they just want to impose their behaviour on everyone else.
I think you look at different parts of how political movements operate, and if they were to come in here and be speaking to you, I don't think they'd be setting off paint bombs, although I don't want to make myself a hostage to fortune.
Walked out of the studio.
Right, okay. But nevertheless, what's going on in the streets is obviously a completely different kind of political action. I mean, Greta Thunberg, to me, I actually think is quite a strikingly impressive figure. And it's quite good to have the youth there. And actually, when young people come on, they carry with them less of the sort of baggage that we have, of the sense of compromise. To see her behave in that way, in an idealistic way, but also in a way that demands attention, despite the fact that she's a young girl, I actually find quite encouraging.
OK, let's move on to another youngish person who's pretty unhappy, Prince Harry. Has he got a case against the media?
Well, everyone's got a case against the media. I mean, the media, behave badly. What's new about that? But he has, I mean, this is most unfortunate. Here he was with his wife on what, by all accounts, until this happened, a very successful tour in Africa. They were wowing everybody. They were showing off their new baby. Everybody was thrilled. And they were repairing the damage that had been done by them. See, this is what his remarks don't take into account, that people are very put out by the fact that Meghan, his wife, would appear to be the sort of key person behind this, they have been behaving in a way that the royal family does not normally behave. They have not been showing that they are, servants of the people. They've hidden the baby away. They wouldn't allow anyone to know who the godparents were, and so on and so forth. People are also very upset by the fact that, having made this tremendous statement about being carbon neutral and not travelling on planes and so on, they then took, 4 aeroplane flights in about 11 days. Now, this is legitimate criticism.
5 SUVs transported
Okay,
to
so this is
Africa,
legitimate
apparently.
criticism. But the point, but those of us of a certain age who remember these 2 children, William and Harry, walking behind their mother's coffin, cannot fail to be always, it's upmost in our minds how damaged they are and what they went through. And so we are instinctively sympathetic to them. And so I'm sympathetic to Harry. This is a cry of tremendous pain because he's obsessed by what happened to his mother. But, Meghan Markle is not Princess Diana. Princess Diana was hounded by the press, but she played the press as well. She didn't die because of the press. The press didn't kill her. She died because she took a motor ride in a car driven by an alcoholic at great speed, and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt.
Being pursued by paparazzi.
Exactly.
Being pursued by paparazzi, but nevertheless, if she hadn't been driven by somebody who was drunk, driving at great speed, and had she been wearing a seatbelt, she may not have
well, you can
died.
debate what the necessary condition was, but nevertheless, if the paparazzi hadn't been behaving that way, this wouldn't have happened. And I sort of feel... So you could take... I'd take all of the stuff on the flights and the SUVs, and obviously you can have that kind of criticism, but there's something about the manner in which they are discussed, which I think is quite disturbing.
But isn't there a basic problem, which is, as Jane Moore says in her article, that one way or another they are in receipt of a great deal of perks, privileges and money because they are public figures. Mm-hmm. And you can't, and they enjoy their celebrity and all the rest of it. And you can't do that and then turn around and somehow say, we're private citizens, we shouldn't be subjected to scrutiny. They're not private citizens.
So I didn't see the part where he said that we shouldn't be subjected to scrutiny. What he said is we shouldn't be misrepresented and that there is a vendetta against us. Now, I have to say, look at some of the language that she uses to illustrate her argument here. She says at one point, he mustn't wield the loss of his mother as a weapon to try to shut down valid criticism. You think, what an abysmal way to talk about the death of someone's mother, as if he is so cynical that he would use it in order to try to silence
She didn't say cynical.
Well, she says he's wielding it as a weapon. I mean, if you're sitting there thinking, I am not actually I'm so emotionally detached from the death of my mother that I will then use it to try to shut down criticism, of course, it heavily implies a degree of cynicism which no normal human being would be capable.
But you see, what this doesn't take into account is something that Stephen Glover, I think, correctly points out, that far from sort of having it in for them, the press and the public are very forgiving about them. For example, Prince Harry, in his youth, wearing Nazi insignia at a private party, cavorting with naked women in Las Vegas. But then, he redeemed himself in the public eye as a brave soldier in Afghanistan and by his work in the Invictus Games. People are very ready, all too ready and willing, and quite rightly so, to give them the benefit of the doubt. They were thrilled by this very successful tour in Africa. People in the press gave them very, very respectful treatment.
They're ready to give him the benefit of the doubt. I do not believe that they're ready to give her the benefit of the doubt, and therein lies the rather important distinction in the manner in which the two of them are treated.
She was getting favourable publicity in Africa. Nobody was saying...
I'm not saying that they've never written a positive story, but there is a relentless drumbeat against her.
Her behaviour was redeeming herself in Africa.
The real question is, in the real world, was he wise to pick this fight with all the press?
No.
I don't think it's necessarily unwise. I understand that there are risks to what he's doing, both in the legal fight, but more importantly in the statement. Nevertheless, he is trying to draw a line to say, look, 2 of us can play here, and if you keep on writing this stuff, I will have a response. And I think people may find normal readers of the newspapers in which these things are published that they instinctively have more human sympathy with his argument than the ones that they're reading here.
But what stuff?
Well, they may well do. The human condition is a complicated thing.
What stuff is the press not supposed to write? Is it not supposed to write any criticism of their behaviour?
Of course, that's not the argument. And that's not the argument that he made.
What are the examples he has produced of being misrepresented? I'd like to know. If he was misrepresented, that's extremely bad. Well, where are the examples?
The specific example is exactly what the lawsuit is on, which is that the letter, and I do not know the facts about this case, but that the letter was misrepresented. Words were taken out of specific sentences in order to portray her in a certain way.
One doesn't know the details
but that is the example.
But is he only talking about that letter? This went much further than that. He's talking about the press in general misrepresenting his wife and therefore potentially killing her like it killed his mother.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. I know you're both joining me on the All Out Politics podcast this week, so don't think we'll be talking about Prince Harry, but we will have lots to discuss then. Thank you.